Obi sat on one side of the road, planning his escape route from poverty, when he saw some lights in the bush. As he looked well, he saw more lights. While the other people were busy with the car, the lights came closer. Suddenly, many armed men ran out from both sides of the road and started shooting in the air. All the doctors were running out of their offices. They were all running towards one direction. Other patients were so scared as they saw all the doctors moving in one direction. The doctors were going to Obi's room. Obi, who was the first patient to be in a coma in this hospital, had just woken up and all the doctors were rushing to see him. Everybody was jubilating and happy because Obi, who had been in a coma for the past 3 days, had woken up. Anita, who is just 8 weeks pregnant, was seated beside her husband Obi and thanking God for bringing him back to life. The doctors rushed in and started attending to him. When Obi fully regained consciousness, the first thing he said was, "Where is the suitcase?" The doctors asked him to calm down and get better before looking for the suitcase. But he insisted and started shouting and crying, "Where is the suitcase? Where is the suitcase?" So they told him that the suitcase was damaged in the accident. Immediately Obi heard this, he fainted. Again, the doctors began to revive him. 10 minutes later, Obi woke up and began to cry. He was crying because he knew that something terrible must have happened at the factory where he works. When the people around saw Obi crying, they were surprised. They wondered what would make a grown man like Obi to cry. So they began to console him because they knew that something terrible must have happened to Obi for him to be crying. Later that evening, Obi sat on his bed in silence. He was thinking about what he saw in coma. It looked like a dream, but he couldn't make sense out of it. While Obi was in a coma, he saw himself traveling in a long bus with a lot of people at night. Again, he saw himself surrounded in a forest by half-naked cavemen who wanted to attack him. He had a gun, but whenever he tried to shoot at the cavemen, the gun will not work. So while the other people in the hospital were happy that Obi is now fully okay, Obi was lost in thoughts, thinking about the things he saw while in coma. The doctor told Anita, Obi's wife, that her husband will spend 2 more days in the hospital so that the doctors can fully observe him to confirm that he is fine before discharging him. On the day Obi was discharged from the hospital, he received an email from the office. As he opened the mail, he found out that he has been sacked from the company where he worked as the director of operations. The letter states that Obi was sacked because he was part of the cause of the fire incident at the factory. The fire burnt down about half of the factory, and this has really affected everything about the factory. The news got Obi shattered. When they reached home, he told his wife about the sack mail he received. She was so sad and began to cry. Anita, who is pregnant, imagined how life would be for her family now that her husband has lost his job. She knows that her small business is not enough to sustain them. As Obi watched his wife cry, he became troubled. That night, he decided that he must leave Lagos to see if he can start his life again somewhere else. His wife is pregnant, so he needed money as quickly as possible. Very early the next morning, Obi told his wife Anita of his plans to leave the city so that he can get his life back. However, Anita did not support his plan. She could not imagine how she would take care of their son alone as she is pregnant with another child. The city of Lagos was too rough for her to stay alone, and she really needed his support. She begged her husband to stay and see how they could survive in Lagos, but his mind was already made up. He needs to find a reasonable job before the birth of his second child. The following day, Anita woke up to find a note by her bedside. The note says that Obi is on his way to Enugu to see if his cousin who is a senior government official, could help him. He promised to be back before the birth of his child. Anita was almost 9 weeks pregnant and her morning sickness gets serious sometimes. While she was still looking at the piece of paper, tears rolled down her cheek. She sat on the bed and started crying. Her son Obiora, who is just 3 years old, came in and saw his mother crying, but he couldn't understand what was happening. Hi, are you tired of unreliable service providers and artisans in Nigeria? Discover top-notch service providers and artisans with anyservice.ng. Your one-stop solution awaits at www.anyservice.ng or download the AnyService.ng app on Google Play Store. Obi, who left his house before sunrise, arrived at the park only to find out the bus he planned to take to Enugu had gone. While on his way to the park, Obi was delayed as a result of the usual high traffic in Lagos, so he missed the bus. Obi thought that this was a bad omen. His heart told him to go back to his wife and child, but his brain told him to continue to Enugu. As a rational man, he decided to follow his brain and look for the next bus to Enugu. The next bus leaves the park at 8 p.m. for Enugu. So he paid for the journey and waited for the time the bus would take off. When Obi entered the bus, he was lucky to find a seat near the window. He slid the window open and fresh air rushed in. All he was thinking about right then was how he would get his life back when he gets to Enugu. As other passengers entered the bus, he remembered his dream while he was in a coma at the hospital. Now, he is seated in a bus with many travelers just as he had seen in his dream. He said to himself, was that just an ordinary dream? The bus took off and minutes later he fell asleep. When he opened his eyes, he noticed that they were already in Ogun State. There were about 28 passengers in the bus and everyone was sleeping except Obi and the driver. He felt like saying a prayer, so he decided to say his rosary, but he searched his pocket, he didn't find his rosary. So he slept off again without saying a prayer. The journey continued, but suddenly they entered a deep pothole which woke everyone up and the car slowly came to a halt. Unfortunately, the bus had a tire burst as a result of the pothole. Also, oil started leaking from underneath the car. The passengers came down from the bus and blamed the driver for being reckless and inexperienced. The bus stopped in the middle of nowhere and they needed to find a way to fix the car as quickly as possible. While everyone was confused, Obi checked the map on his phone and found out that they were close to Benin City. It was 11 p.m. and the driver didn't know where he would find a mechanic by that time. When everyone had already lost hope, Obi decided to visit anyservice.ng. Maybe he can find a mechanic that night. Obi searched the website and found some mechanics in nearby communities. So he decided to call them and see which of them would come. He called the first person. The phone rang but no one answered. Then he called the second mechanic. The mechanic picked the phone but complained that it was too late for him to come. As Obi was calling the third mechanic, all the passengers gathered around him and hoped that the mechanic would agree to come. Finally, the mechanic picked up the phone but refused to come because it was already late. When the passengers heard this, they started begging him. Even the driver promised to drop him off at his house once the bus is repaired in addition to his payment. When the mechanic heard the voices of the stranded passengers over the phone, he took pity on them and agreed to come and fix the bus. Some minutes later, the mechanic arrived with his apprentice and everyone was hopeful. All the men volunteered to assist the mechanic except Obi, who said that he has done his own part by getting them a mechanic through anyservice.ng. So, Obi distanced himself from the others as they rendered their assistance to the mechanic. Obi sat on one side of the road, planning his escape route from poverty, when he saw some lights in the bush. As he looked well to understand what was happening, he saw more lights. It now looked like the lights had surrounded all of them. While the other people were busy with the car, the lights came closer. Suddenly, many armed men ran out from both sides of the road and started shooting in the air. There was panic everywhere. Some of the passengers ran into the bush while others were just screaming. But Obi was still too confused to move, as he was yet to understand what was happening.